Victor Blackthorne didn't knock. He rode onto Eliza Voss's land with 6 men at his back and a smirk already settled on his face, like a man arriving to collect something that already belonged to him. He didn't dismount. He sat up on that horse and looked at the cracked earth, the listing fence post, the barn with its roof half caved from the last hard wind, and he actually laughed, a short, contemptuous sound that carried all the way to where Eliza stood on the porch with her father's rifle in her hands. "Your daddy's been dead, what, 3 months?" he said. Not a question, more like a ledger entry. "And already the place looks like it's been dead longer." Eliza didn't answer. "I'll give you what I gave the others," Blackthorne continued, pulling a folded paper from inside his coat and letting it hang between 2 fingers like it was barely worth the effort. "Fair price. Generous even, considering." He dropped it. Let it fall in the dust between his horse's hooves. "You've got until the end of the month." He turned and rode off without waiting for a reply. Because in Red Hollow territory, Victor Blackthorne had never needed to wait for anything. That was the moment Eliza Voss decided she would rather burn the land herself than let him have it. If you've ever stood in a place that meant everything to you and felt someone trying to take it, you already know what she felt standing there, watching that man ride away like he'd already won. Stay with us. Subscribe to the channel and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens next is the kind of thing people talk about for years. Hit that like button and drop a comment letting us know what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it really started. The land had not always looked like something that was losing. Eliza knew that. She'd grown up watching her father work it through seasons that had no right to be survived. Late frosts that killed the seedlings, summer droughts that turned the creek to a trickle, a cattle sickness in her 14th year that took 11 animals in 8 days. Each time, Nathan Voss had gotten up before the sun and gone back to the work, not because he believed things would be easy, but because he believed the land was worth the cost. He'd taught her that. He'd taught her almost everything she knew. What he hadn't taught her, what she suspected he hadn't known, was what to do when the land was worth the cost, but the money was gone anyway. She stood on the porch that evening after Blackthorne's dust had settled, and she looked at the paper she'd picked up off the ground. The offer was real, the numbers were real, and they were insulting. A fraction of what the property was worth even in its current state, a fraction of what her father had refused when Blackthorne had made the same pitch 2 years ago. Nathan had refused to sell. He'd said no so plainly and so finally that Blackthorne hadn't come back in person after that. He'd sent men instead. Little problems. A section of fence that needed repairing, cattle that wandered off overnight, a fire in the pasture that the sheriff ruled an accident. After Nathan died, Eliza had found his accounting ledger in the desk drawer where he kept things he didn't want her to worry about. She'd sat down at that desk and opened it and spent the better part of an hour going through it. And when she was done, she understood for the first time how close they had actually been. Not just to the edge, but past it, already falling, the only question being how long the fall would take. The debt was real. The mortgage on the equipment was real. The 3 months of missed payments to the grain supplier in town were real. And her father had been managing all of it in that stubborn, private way of his. Not because he was a foolish man, but because he was a man who believed problems should be solved before they were announced. He'd run out of time to solve this one. Eliza had been 26 when he died. She was 26 now, 3 months later, standing on the same porch, holding an offer that would erase the debt and leave her with almost nothing, offered by a man who had made the same offer to 15 other families in the territory and ended up with their land every single time. She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket. She was not going to sell. She was not entirely certain how she was going to survive, but she was not going to sell. The idea of the marriage arrangement had not been hers. It had come from Ruth Candler, who was 70 years old and had lived in Red Hollow longer than almost anyone and had strong opinions about everything, including, apparently, what Eliza Voss needed to do to save her father's ranch. Ruth had come by 2 weeks after the funeral, sat down at the kitchen table without being invited, and said, "You need a partner. Not a hand, not a hired man, a partner. Someone with a stake in the outcome." "I'm not looking to get married," Eliza had said. "I didn't ask what you were looking for. I asked what you needed." Ruth had a way of doing that, cutting through the thing you said to the thing you meant to avoid. Eliza had found it irritating since childhood and had never fully stopped finding it irritating. "There are men who come through this territory looking to settle," Ruth continued. Men who have skills, who want land, who need a situation as much as you do. It doesn't have to be a love story. It has to be an arrangement that works. And you know such a man. I know a man who knows such men. I'll write a letter. Eliza had said she'd think about it. Ruth had taken that to mean yes, which was probably accurate. The letter went out. A reply came back. And 3 weeks later, a man was coming. The description Ruth had relayed was modest, older, experienced, steady. A rancher who'd had land out east and sold it when his wife died, looking to start over somewhere quieter. Eliza had built a picture of him in her head without entirely meaning to. Weathered, deliberate, the kind of man who wouldn't say much but would show up to the work. She was not prepared for what actually rode in off the North Trail on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. She heard the horse before she saw the rider. A single animal, moving at an easy pace, not hurrying. She came around from the side of the house where she'd been trying to fix the gutter that kept pulling away from the eave, and she shaded her eyes against the afternoon sun. The rider was young. That was the first thing she registered, and it hit her like a door she hadn't expected to be there. Not young like a boy, young like a man who had been through enough to look older than his years, but whose years themselves were not many. Mid-30s at most. He sat the horse like he'd been born on one, that specific kind of ease that wasn't relaxation, but something more like readiness. Like a man who had learned that comfort and alertness didn't have to be opposites. He pulled up at the edge of the yard and looked at the property the same way she imagined a doctor might look at a patient. Not with judgment exactly, but with assessment. Taking inventory. Then he looked at her. "You're Eliza Voss," he said. Not a question. "I am. And you're not what I was expecting." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "I've been told that before." He dismounted. He was taller than she'd judged from the horse, and the coat he wore was trail-worn but not ragged. There was a sidearm on his hip that he wore with the same ease as the rest of him. Not a display, just a fact. "Cole Maverick," he said, and put out his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm without trying to prove anything. "Ruth said you were older," she said. "Ruth's 70. Everyone under 50 looks young to Ruth." Eliza almost laughed. She caught it before it came out, which felt like the right call for a first meeting with a stranger who was technically here to discuss becoming her husband. "She said you were a rancher." "I have been." He glanced at the guttering she'd been working on, the pulled nails, the section that had dropped away from the wood. "I've been other things too." "What other things?" He looked at her directly then, in a way that was neither evasive nor aggressive but simply honest, in that uncomfortable way that forces you to reckon with the fact that you're not going to get a partial answer. "Marshall, 5 years. Before that, trail work. Before that, things not worth mentioning." "And why does a former marshal need a marriage arrangement to get land? Why does a woman with land need a stranger to help her keep it?" She didn't answer. He hadn't needed her to. He'd made the point. They stood there for a moment in the dust of the yard, taking each other's measure. The ranch spread out around them in its damaged, insufficient state. The barn with its listing door, the fence sections that were more intention than structure, the dry creek bed that hadn't seen moving water in 6 weeks. "What do you need," he said, "to save this place?" It was such a plain question, no performance in it, just a question asked by someone who genuinely wanted to know the answer before they agreed to anything. Eliza found herself thinking about all the ways she'd imagined answering that question for 3 months. To the bank, to her father's creditors, to herself at 2 a.m. when she couldn't sleep. She'd always tangled it up, the need and the pride and the stubbornness all knotted together. "Water," she said. "The upper creek's been redirected. I think someone moved a berm about 2 miles north and it's pulling the flow away from us. I need someone to find where it's happening and fix it before the cattle start dying. I need the south fence rebuilt. It's been cut, not broken. Someone's been cutting it at night. I need—" She stopped. "I need someone who won't leave when it gets hard. That's what I need most." Cole nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "That's it? Just all right?" "You asked me what you needed. I heard you. What else do you want me to say?" She thought about it. "Nothing, I suppose." "Then let's go look at the creek." He found the berm problem in 2 hours. It had been done deliberately and recently. Not a natural shift, but a constructed one. Someone had piled rock and packed earth across a secondary channel, in a way that forced the water toward the blackthorn grazing land to the north and pulled it away from Voss property. It wasn't complicated. It was exactly the kind of thing that could be done quietly, at night, by 2 or 3 men who knew what they were doing. Cole stood at the site and said nothing for a long moment. "This has been here about 6 weeks," he said finally. "That's when the creek started dropping. And this is Blackthorn's work." "I can't prove it." He looked at her. "I didn't ask if you could prove it." She held his gaze. "Yes, it's Blackthorn's work." He crouched and ran his hands over the stacked rocks, reading them like a text she didn't have the training to understand. "These were brought in, not quarried from the stream bed. You can see the different coloring on the underside." He stood. "Whoever did it was patient. This was planned well before they executed it. Blackthorn plans everything. Tell me about him." So she did. Standing beside the redirected creek in the cooling afternoon, she told him about Victor Blackthorn and the way he'd built his land empire in Red Hollow. Not through honest work or superior claim, but through pressure, manipulation, and the particular patience of a man who understood that most people would break before he did. She told him about the 15 families who'd sold, about the Harmon widow whose fences had been cut so many times that she'd finally given up and taken the offer, and about young Peter Shell whose sheep had died of something the vet couldn't explain, and about the Garcias who'd had their water rights challenged in a court 3 counties over and couldn't afford the travel, let alone the legal fees. Cole listened without interrupting. He had the quality, she was learning, of being able to be very still while remaining completely present, the kind of listening that was actually listening, not just waiting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How much do you owe?" he asked. The question landed with a particular weight. She'd expected to have to be pulled toward it, coaxed. Instead, it was just there, plain and direct. "Enough," she said. "How much?" She told him. The full number. The mortgage, the supplier debt, the 3 payments behind on the equipment loan. She told him because he asked like a man who needed information to do a job, not like a man waiting to judge her. He didn't flinch. He didn't offer reassurance. He just nodded. "And if you sold at Blackthorn's price?" "It would clear the debt and leave me almost nothing." "But you're not selling." "No." "Then we fix the creek, we rebuild the fence, and we figure out how to buy enough time for the land to start producing again." He looked at the berm. "I'll start here tomorrow morning. I'll need a full day, maybe 2. I can help." "I expect you will." He said it without condescension, more like the simple statement of a man who'd noticed she was competent and had adjusted his expectations accordingly. "What's the best water source we can work from while the main channel's blocked?" She told him about the spring on the east slope. They talked for another 20 minutes, practical and specific, the way people talk when they're actually solving a problem rather than discussing it. By the time they walked back to the ranch, it was nearly dark. At the porch, she stopped. "You haven't asked about the arrangement." "I figured we'd get to it." Most men would have led with it. He looked at the house, then at her. "I'm not interested in a piece of paper if the land's going to be taken by the end of the month. Let's see if there's something worth arranging first." It was perhaps the most pragmatic thing anyone had said to her since her father died, and she found it deeply, unexpectedly, settling. "There's a room at the back of the house," she said. "It's yours while you're working here." He nodded. "Thank you." She went inside. He went to settle his horse in the damaged barn. And that was the beginning. Not romantic, not dramatic, just 2 people who needed something from each other and had agreed to be honest about it, which is maybe the most solid foundation there is for anything that actually lasts. The first week, he worked. That was what she noticed first. Not what he said, which was little, but what he did, which was continuous. I was up before her every morning, which she hadn't expected because she was up early. He worked on the creek berm restoration with a focused, systematic thoroughness that reminded her of her father, but without her father's tendency to work himself past the point of function and then have to rest for a day. Cole stopped when the light was gone and ate whatever she put in front of him without comment, which she took as appreciation rather than indifference because he always cleaned the plate. He rebuilt the south fence section on the 3rd day, working from one post to the next, with the kind of economy of motion that came from a person who had done a thing many times and didn't need to think about each step separately. She worked alongside him. She'd expected some friction around that. Men sometimes had opinions about women working alongside them, had ways of making the arrangement feel like charity. But Cole didn't seem to have that particular issue. He handed her tools when she needed them, explained his approach when it was useful to explain, and otherwise simply worked as though they were two people doing a job. On the fourth evening, he asked about the barn roof. "It's been like that since the storm in July," she said. "I haven't had the lumber. I can get lumber from the Morrison mill if you trust me to negotiate." "What would you trade?" "Labor. They've got a drainage problem on the north end of their property. I can fix it in a day. They'll call it even." She looked at him. "You've been in Red Hollow less than a week, and you already know about the Morrison mill's drainage problem." I talk to people when I'm in town," he said. It was simple, the way he said it. Not a boast, just information. "Who else did you talk to?" "The man at the grain store, the woman who runs the boarding house, Sheriff Dolan." He paused. "I don't like the sheriff." "Most people don't." "He's on Blackthorn's payroll." Again, not a question. "I've suspected it for 2 years, can't prove it." Cole nodded. "You say that a lot. Can't prove it." "Because proof is what matters." He considered that. "It does. And it doesn't. Proof matters in a courtroom. Out here what matters is who's watching and who's willing to say what they saw." He turned his cup in his hands. "Blackthorn's problem isn't that he's unbeatable. His problem is that he's made too many enemies. People are quiet about it because they're afraid. But the fear's built on the belief that they're alone. And if they weren't alone?" He looked at her. "Then the math changes." She sat with that for a moment. Through the window, she could see the dark shapes of the east slope, the spring she'd told him about, the ridge where her father used to ride at dawn when he needed to think. "You're saying we can't fight this alone," she said. "I'm saying we shouldn't have to." It was the first time he'd said we. She noticed it. She didn't comment on it, but she noticed it. The marriage arrangement was completed on a Saturday morning in Ruth Candler's parlor, with Ruth herself as witness, and a circuit judge who came through Red Hollow twice a year and asked no questions as long as the paperwork was in order. It was not a ceremony so much as a transaction. There were words said and papers signed and hands shaken, and afterward Ruth made coffee and said something about wishing them luck in a tone that suggested she thought they were going to need it. On the walk back to the ranch, Eliza said, "You should know I'm not expecting anything from this beyond what we discussed." "I know," Cole said, "and I'm not the kind of woman who—" "Eliza." He said it without impatience, just firmly. "I know. I'm not here for anything you haven't offered." She nodded, looked at the road. "All right. All right." They walked the rest of the way in silence, which was becoming, she noticed, a comfortable kind of silence between them, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. Blackthorn found out about Cole within 2 weeks. Of course he did. Red Hollow was not a large territory, and Blackthorn had ears in it. She'd known he would find out and had been waiting for the response. It came first as a man at the fence line who just stood there watching. Not working, not threatening, just watching. She saw him from the east slope when she was riding in the evening, and when she came home and told Cole, he said, "How many?" "Just one. But he was there for an hour." "There'll be more." He was matter-of-fact about it. Blackthorn's taking stock, figuring out what changed. "Does it change his calculations? That you're here?" Cole thought about it. "It complicates them. He expected a woman alone. That's a known quantity to a man like him. He knows how to handle a woman alone. And a woman with a former marshal for a husband? That's a different problem." He looked at his hands, the calluses on them, the thin scar across the back of his right hand that she'd noticed but not asked about. He'll move more carefully now, but he'll still move. Men like Blackthorn don't change direction just because the road gets harder. They just plan more. "So what do we do?" He looked at her. "We give him something to plan around." She waited. "We fix the creek. We fix the fences. We make it visible that this land is being worked and maintained and isn't dying anymore. And we make it known we're not the only ones who've had these problems." He leaned forward slightly. "The Harmon widow, young Shell, the Garcias, they all sold or gave up. But I'd bet none of them thought they had any choice. They didn't have any choice. They were alone. And if someone offered them a different option?" She started to say something and then stopped because she could see where he was going. It was the same place she'd been circling for months, the idea she hadn't let herself land on because it seemed too large and too unlikely, and because it required other people to be braver than people generally were when they were frightened. "You want to organize them?" she said. "I want to give them the opportunity to organize themselves." He made the distinction without emphasis, but it was there. "There's a difference. I'm not asking anyone to follow me into something dangerous. I'm asking if they'd like to know they're not standing alone." Outside, the wind was picking up again. She could hear it working at the guttering he'd repaired, testing it, finding it held. "Some of them have already sold," she said. "They've taken his money. They've signed their land over." "I know. They might not want to revisit that. Some won't. Some might." He met her eyes. "All I know is that the situation as it stands has one ending, and I've seen that ending before. I don't want to watch it happen again." That last sentence landed differently from the rest of what he said. There was something personal in it that he hadn't offered before, and he seemed to know it. He didn't look away, but he didn't explain it either. She didn't push. There would be time, or there wouldn't. Right now, there was other work. "The Harmon place is 12 miles north," she said. "She usually accepts visitors on Thursday mornings." Cole nodded. "Thursday, then." "I went to see Margaret Harmon on Thursday and came back that evening with a quieter face than usual." "How did it go?" Eliza asked. He sat down at the table and was silent for a moment. "She cried," he said. "Not dramatically, just the fact of it. Not in front of me. I came around the back of the house, and she was sitting on the steps, and I could see she'd been crying. She stood up and composed herself before I got close enough for her to think I'd noticed." Eliza waited. "She said she's not interested, said she signed the papers and took the money, and she's trying to move forward." He looked at the table. "But she also said that her neighbor, a man named Briggs, with a sheep operation about 8 miles east, has been having the same problems she had before she sold. Same pattern. Water pressure dropping, fences cut at night, one of his sheepdogs poisoned 2 weeks ago." Eliza closed her eyes for a moment. "He hasn't sold yet," Cole continued, "and he's angry about it. Not the quiet, frightened kind of angry, the other kind. The kind that does something stupid. Or the kind that does something useful, depending on how it's directed." He looked up. "I'd like to go talk to him." "I'll come with you." He didn't argue with that. He'd stopped arguing with her joining things 3 days into the first week. She'd decided that was one of his better qualities. "There's something else," he said. "Tell me." Margaret Harmon said that before she sold, she found something, documents. Blackthorn's men had been out to survey her land multiple times without permission, and one of them dropped a notebook. She found it after they'd gone. She said she didn't know what it meant at the time, and she was so frightened she just put it away. "Where?" "In her house still, she thinks. She's not sure if she can find it." He paused. "But she remembers it had numbers in it, survey numbers, land coordinates, multiple properties." Eliza felt something shift in the room, a charge in the air, the feeling of a thing that had been out of reach suddenly becoming, maybe, not so far. "If he was surveying land he didn't own," she said carefully, "without permission, it might not mean anything by itself, but combined with the other patterns—" He stopped. "I'm not a lawyer, but I know enough to know that if there's a pattern and there's documentation, that changes what's possible. She'd have to be willing to let us see it, to let someone else see it. She might be willing. She's not a woman without spine. She's a woman who believes she was alone." He looked at her steadily. "That's a different thing." Eliza stood up from the table and walked to the window. Outside, the repaired south fence caught the moonlight at the far edge of the property, straight and solid where it had been sagging and broken. The creek was running again. She could hear it faintly on quiet nights, which she hadn't been able to hear in months. Small things, but they were real things. "Tomorrow we go see Briggs," she said. "Tomorrow we go see Briggs." She turned back to the room. "Cole." He looked at her. "What did you mean earlier, when you said you didn't want to watch it happen again?" He was still for a moment. "There was a town," he said, "about 60 miles north of here, before I came through Red Hollow. Small place. Situation like this, one family with money and power, everyone else at the edge of what they could survive. I was passing through and I could see what was happening. I told myself it wasn't my business." He looked at the table. "By spring, the whole community was gone, scattered, the land sitting empty now under one man's name." "And you were already gone." "I was already gone." He said it flat, without excuse. I talked myself into believing I couldn't have changed anything. Maybe I couldn't have, but I didn't try. He met her eyes. I'm trying this time. There was nothing she could say to that wouldn't make it smaller, so she just nodded. Get some sleep, she said. Long ride tomorrow. She went to bed and lay in the dark, listening to the creek she could barely hear, running again where it was supposed to run, water moving where it had been blocked. Outside, the wind moved through the repaired fence without pulling it down. It was a small thing, that fence. But every morning it was still standing was a morning that mattered, and Eliza Voss had learned, somewhere in the long, ungentle months since her father died, that small things that hold are sometimes the only foundation there is for anything larger to be built on. She was not sure, lying there, what was going to happen. She was not sure the plan would work, or that the people they were going to ask would say yes, or that any of it would be enough against a man like Blackthorne with his money and his patience and his 6 men who rode onto other people's land without knocking. But she was less alone than she had been a month ago. And the creek was running. That was enough to sleep on. Tom Briggs was not what Cole had expected, which was saying something because Cole had learned not to expect much in particular about anyone. I was younger than the description suggested. Late 20s maybe, with the kind of lean that came from actual work rather than circumstance, and a jaw that looked like it had been set in permanent argument. He met them at the gate of his property with a rifle over his arm, not pointed at anything, just present, which was the body language of a man who had learned that visitors didn't always come with good intentions. He looked at Cole. He looked at Eliza. He looked back at Cole. You're the one who married the Voss woman, he said. I am, Cole said. And you're here because Margaret Harmon told us about your dog, Eliza said. Something moved across Briggs's face at that. Not grief exactly, more like the tight-wound look of a man who had already processed the grief and was now living somewhere on the other side of it, in the territory of anger that doesn't have anywhere to go yet. Margaret shouldn't be talking about my business. She talked about it because she recognized it, Cole said, because it happened to her before she sold. Briggs looked at the rifle in his arm like he'd forgotten it was there. He lowered it slightly. I'm not selling. We know, Eliza said. Neither are we. A pause. The wind moved through the dry grass on the hill behind his property, and somewhere out of sight a sheep called and was answered by another, and Briggs stood there working through something in his head that took long enough that Cole didn't interrupt it. Come inside, Briggs finally said. I'll put coffee on. The inside of the Briggs house was the inside of a man living alone and not apologizing for it. Functional, spare, one good chair and one bad one. A table that needed leveling. A shelf of books that surprised Eliza when she looked at the titles. History, mostly. A surveying manual. One novel so worn the cover was gone. He made coffee without asking how they took it and put 3 cups on the table and sat down. The dog's name was Reuben, he said, unprompted. 7 years old, best working dog I've ever had. He wrapped his hands around the cup. The vet said it was probably something he got into in the field. Could have been any number of things. His voice was flat in the way voices get when they're reciting the official version of something they know isn't true. Could have been. But it wasn't, Cole said. No, it wasn't. He looked up. The thing was, Reuben was smart. Not just trained, smart. He wouldn't have gotten into anything in the field. 7 years, and he never once touched bait. He paused. It had to have been put somewhere specific, somewhere he'd go. Inside the fence line. How many times had someone been inside your fence line in the past month? Cole asked. Briggs's mouth tightened. Twice that I know of. Could have been more at night. I can't watch the whole perimeter. And your water pressure? Dropping. Not as bad as some, maybe, but it's dropping and there's no natural reason for it. Cole nodded. Same method they used on the Voss property. They redirect a channel upstream, small enough that it looks like natural drift if you don't know to look for it. Briggs stared at him. They did that to you? Fixed it 3 weeks ago, Cole said. I can show you where they did it on your land if you want, after we're done here. It's the same pattern. And you fixed it. I fixed it. Briggs sat back. He had the look of a man recalibrating, taking in new information and rearranging what he'd already decided about the situation. What are you here to ask me? Nothing yet, Cole said. We're here to tell you that what's happening to you is happening on a pattern. It happened to the Voss ranch, to the Harmon property, to the Garcias, to 4 other families I've talked to in the past 2 weeks. It's not random, it's not bad luck, and it's not going to stop on its own. I know that already. Then you also know that it ends one of 2 ways. Briggs looked at him. I sell or I don't. You sell or you're still standing when it gets worse. Cole said it without drama, just the facts of it. They've been patient with you so far because they like to let the pressure build before they increase it. The dog was a message. The water's a message. The next message won't be as quiet. The kitchen was silent for a moment. Outside, the sheep moved somewhere, hooves on dry earth. What's the other option? Briggs asked. His voice had changed, still controlled, but with something underneath it now, something that had been waiting to have somewhere to go. Eliza leaned forward slightly. That you're not the only one saying no. They were there for 2 hours. By the end of it, Briggs had agreed to talk to 2 of his own neighbors, men he trusted, whose land bordered his on the east, and to send word when he'd done it. He hadn't agreed to anything larger yet. That was fine. That was how it worked, Cole had found. People needed to move at the speed of what they could actually believe, and pushing them faster than that broke the thing before it formed. On the ride back, the afternoon had turned the color it got before the temperature dropped, that low amber light that made everything look older than it was. He's going to say yes, Eliza said. Probably. He's angry enough. Anger's not enough on its own, Cole said. Angry men do stupid things. He's also smart, and that's what makes it useful. He watched the road ahead. He asked the right questions. He wanted to understand the mechanism, not just the injustice of it. Is there a difference? There's a practical difference. A man who understands how the mechanism works can help you dismantle it. A man who's just angry wants to fight someone. He glanced at her. Fighting someone is rarely the most efficient option. She considered that. You said that like a man who's tried both. I have. She didn't push further, and he didn't offer more, which was becoming their rhythm on the things that came from before. The barn fire happened on a Thursday night. She smelled it before she saw it. Woke up from sleep with the particular shock of fire smell, which is not like other smells, which goes directly past thought to the body and has you moving before you fully form the question of what's happening. She came out of the house, and the barn was already a wall of light, the hay inside gone in minutes because hay goes fast and it had been dry, the wood catching in the way dry wood does, in a territory that hadn't seen significant rain in 2 months. Cole was already there. He'd gotten there before her, which she couldn't account for later. She'd wondered if he'd been awake, or if he simply moved faster than she did when something went wrong. He was on the water pump working it hard, but the pump pulled from the cistern, and the cistern level was low, and they both knew within 2 minutes that the barn was not going to be saved. What could be saved was the animals. He'd already gotten the horses out. She could see them tied at the far fence post, agitated but clear of the heat. The 2 remaining cattle were on the east side of the property, away from the structure. The tools, she said, back wall, He looked at her, and she understood he'd already gone into the barn. Once. For what he could carry. The hammer her father had used since before she was born. The good saw. The surveying equipment he'd bought with 2 months of savings. He'd gone into the burning barn to get them. She stood there for a moment with that fact, and then let it go because there wasn't time for it. They worked the pump until the cistern was empty, and then stood and watched the rest of it go. It took longer than she expected. It always does. Somehow, the watching of a thing burn, time stretches and slows, and you find yourself marking small events. The moment a beam goes. The particular sound a structure makes when it starts to lean. When it was down to framework and ash, she sat on the ground because there was nothing else to do. Cole sat beside her. Neither of them said anything for a while. They were watching, he said, finally. Whoever said it. They waited until the wind was out of the east so it wouldn't spread to the house. She looked at him. She stopped. They didn't want to destroy the house. They wanted to destroy what was in the barn. The tools, the supplies, the equipment storage. He was looking at the remains. This is a setback. It's designed to feel like an ending, but it's actually a setback. There's a difference. You keep finding differences. Because they matter. He looked at her directly. Do you want me to tell you it's fine? It's not fine. It's a serious blow and it's going to set us back and tomorrow's going to be hard. But it's a setback, not an ending, and those are not the same thing. She looked at the ash and the smoking framework and the place where 3 months of her family's stored history and equipment had been. Cole. Yeah. Why did you go back in? He was quiet for a moment. Your father's hammer was on the bench by the door. I could see it from outside. He turned the hammer in his hands. She could see it now in the firelight, an old thing, wood handle worn smooth from decades of use. Seemed like the kind of thing that mattered. She took the hammer from him, held it. The weight of it was familiar in a way nothing else in her life was familiar anymore. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me. I've still got both eyebrows, so it wasn't heroic, it was just fast. He said it lightly, and she almost laughed, and that almost laugh was the most human thing she'd felt in days. She did not sleep the rest of that night. By the time dawn came, she had made a list in her father's ledger, a new list, not his, in her own handwriting. What was lost? What was needed? What could be substituted and what couldn't? She wrote it all down with the same deliberate clarity her father had used for his accounting, because writing things down turned them from catastrophe into problems. And problems had solutions even when they were expensive and complicated. Cole found her at the table when he came in from checking the horses at first light. He looked at the list without touching it. The Morrison Mill owes me that labor exchange, he said. I can get lumber for a new structure, smaller but functional. And the tools? Some we can replace. The irreplaceable ones are already here. He meant the hammer, she understood. The things he'd carried out. I'm going to town, she said. He looked at her. To do what? To file a report with the sheriff. She held up a hand before he could speak. I know what you think of Dolan. I know he's likely useless and possibly corrupt, but I want it on record. I want the date and the description and the circumstances all written down somewhere official so that when we're done with all of this, there's a paper trail that shows what was done to us. He considered that for a moment. Bring me with you. I didn't say you needed me. I said, bring me. He said it flat, not as an argument, just as a statement of preference. Dolan's more careful when there's a witness. She thought about arguing and decided against it. He wasn't wrong. Sheriff Dolan received them in his office with the particular quality of attention that men give to things they're pretending to take seriously. He was somewhere in his 50s, carrying the weight of a man who'd stopped doing physical work some years ago and had let the years settle on him in the way they do. He had a pleasant face and careful eyes, which was a combination Eliza had learned not to trust. He wrote down what she told him. He asked the questions that were required. He expressed sympathy about the barn. Fire damage is serious business, he said, shaking his head, especially in a dry season. Hard to say what causes it sometimes. Someone said it, Eliza said. Now, do you have any evidence of that? The wind pattern, the way it started from the southwest corner, which is the corner farthest from any natural friction source, and the fact that I've been having deliberate property damage for 3 months. The fence incidents? Among other things. Dolan looked at his paper. Those were ruled inconclusive. They were cut, Eliza said. Wire doesn't fray in straight lines. Ma'am, I understand you're upset. A fire's an upsetting... Write down arson, Cole said. Dolan looked at him. There was a careful moment. I haven't established that. Write down that the property owner believes it was arson and is requesting it be investigated as such, Cole said. His voice was level, no heat in it, but there was something in his posture that had shifted. A stillness that was a specific kind of stillness, the kind that made people remember they weren't sure how far they wanted to push. That's her right. That's what a report is for. Dolan looked at Cole for another moment. Then he wrote it down. We'll look into it, he said. Good, Cole said. We'll check back. Outside on the street, Eliza said, he's not going to look into anything. No, Cole agreed. But now there's a written record dated today that says you reported it as arson. That's what we came for. She looked at him. You've done this before. Built a paper trail against someone with institutional cover? He looked down the street toward the Blackthorn offices at the far end, the clean-painted building that looked more like a bank than anything else. A few times. It's slow. It feels inadequate. But courts run on paper, and if there's a day when this ends in a courtroom, and I think there will be, you want every dated piece of paper you can get. She looked at the Blackthorn building. He's going to think the fire worked. Let him think it. It's going to make him bolder. Yes. Cole turned away from the building. That's going to be a problem, but it's also going to be a mistake. The letter from Briggs arrived 6 days after the fire, carried by one of his younger neighbors, a boy of about 17 who handed it to Eliza without ceremony and stood waiting in case there was a response. Briggs had talked to his 2 neighbors. They had talked to 2 more. There were 7 families, he wrote, who were willing to meet, not to commit to anything yet, just to meet, to hear what was being said, to understand the situation more fully than they currently did. He'd written the names. She recognized most of them. Small operations, most of them. 1 or 2 individuals, a family here and there, but people who knew the land and knew each other in the loose, careful way of frontier neighbors who depended on each other in practical ways without necessarily being close. She read the letter twice and then handed it to Cole. He read it, set it on the table. 7, she said. 7 is enough to start. Where do we meet? If Blackthorn's watching, not at our property, someplace neutral. He thought for a moment. Briggs's place is central, far enough from Blackthorn's main operations that it doesn't draw attention, and Briggs is the one who organized it. Holding it there gives him standing in the group, which matters. You think about these things. I've organized people before. A pause. Not always under good circumstances, but the mechanics are the same. She looked at him. When you were a marshal, among other times. He folded the letter. I'll write back to Briggs. We'll set a date. The boy was still standing in the doorway waiting for a response, looking slightly uncomfortable with the extended silence of 2 adults thinking things through. Eliza looked at him. Tell Mr. Briggs we'll be in touch within 2 days, and we're grateful for what he's done. The boy nodded and left. The kitchen was quiet again. Outside, the remnant framework of the burned barn was visible through the window. Cole had cleared most of the ash and debris and begun marking out the footprint of the smaller structure he was planning to build in its place. She'd watched him do it the day after the fire, while the ground was still warm in places, methodical and precise, turning the evidence of destruction into a construction plan. She'd thought then, watching him, that there was something in that specific act that was more telling about a person than almost anything they could say about themselves. Cole, she said. He looked at her. After this, whatever happens, what do you want? He looked at the question like a man encountering something unexpected and taking a moment to make sure he understood it fully before responding. What do you mean? You came here for an arrangement, land, a stake, a reason to stay somewhere. That's what you told me at the start. She looked at him steadily. But you've been working this like it's already yours, like it already matters to you, and I want to know if that's real or if that's just how you work. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. The town I told you about, he said finally, the one I left. I've thought about it every day since, not because I think I could have saved it for certain. Maybe I couldn't have, but because I never tried. He looked at the table, then back at her. This place, your father's fence posts and the creek that's running again, and the hammer you hold, like it's a lifeline. This is not a piece of land to me anymore. I don't know exactly when that happened, but it did. Eliza held that for a moment. All right, she said. All right, he said back. It was the same word they'd used after the marriage papers, but it meant something different now, and they both knew it. The meeting at Briggs's property happened on a Sunday when the light was going, but it wasn't dark yet. 7 people standing or sitting in the yard and on the porch, in the uncomfortable arranged way of individuals who know each other by reputation more than by actual familiarity. Cole let Eliza speak first. He'd suggested it on the ride over and she'd almost argued with him, and then she'd understood. These people needed to see that this was her fight too. A former marshal organizing a resistance was one thing. A woman who had stood on this land her whole life and refused to leave was another. She told them what she knew. She told them about the creek and the fences and the barn and the arson report that was sitting in Dolan's files going nowhere. She told them about the documents Margaret Harmon had found and hadn't known what to do with. She told them about the survey numbers and what they might mean. She did not tell them what to do. She told them what she knew and what she thought, and then she stopped. The man to her left, older, a sheep farmer named Garrett, with hands like knotted rope, said, "Blackthorn's got the sheriff. He's got the county surveyor. He's probably got somebody in the land office too." "Probably," Eliza said. "So even if you've got documents, The county land office isn't the only land office, Cole said. It was the first thing he'd said. The territorial office in Crestwood is beyond Blackthorn's reach. I spent some time there last week looking at the filing records. A pause. Someone's been submitting preemptive land claims on properties adjacent to existing small ranches. The filings are legal on their face, but they're designed to create challenges to existing ownership when a seller backs out or a property goes to dispute. It's a specific legal strategy, and it requires someone who understands property law. Blackthorn has lawyers, Garrett said. He has a lawyer, one man named Ferris, who's been submitting these filings for 3 years. Cole looked around the group. He's careful, but he made one mistake. 2 of the parcels he filed on overlap each other. Not by much, a few hundred feet, but a filing error like that can be challenged, and if it's challenged, it draws scrutiny to all the other filings. The yard was very quiet. You found that, a woman named Solon said. She ran a small cattle operation with her 2 adult sons. Sitting in the territorial office records. I used to be a marshal. Reading land records is something you learn. And what do we do with that? We need a lawyer who isn't in Blackthorn's pocket, Cole said, which means someone from outside the territory. I have a name, a man in Crestwood who's handled cases like this before. He's not cheap, but if 8 or 9 families are splitting the cost... You're asking us to put money in, Garrett said. I'm asking if you're willing to. Another silence. Eliza watched the faces and understood that she was watching people do the arithmetic of fear, the calculation of what it costs to continue being afraid versus what it costs to try. It was not a simple calculation, and there was no right answer that worked for everyone. Solon's older son, who hadn't spoken, said, My father sold a piece of our eastern acreage 2 years ago because we thought we had to. We didn't know there were others. We thought it was just us being unlucky. He said it to no one in particular. To the heir, maybe. His mother looked at him. Then she looked at Eliza. What do you need from us right now? Tonight, specifically. Tonight, just a yes or no on whether you're willing to have a second meeting, Eliza said, where we talk to the Crestwood lawyer, where we hear what the actual legal options are. She paused. Nobody's committing to anything tonight except a willingness to hear more. It was the right thing to say. She could feel it in the way the tension in the yard shifted slightly, the particular relief of people who've been braced for someone to demand more than they're ready to give, and found the demand smaller than they feared. One by one, they said yes. Garrett last, and with visible reluctance, but he said it. 7 people. 7 small ranches and sheep operations and cattle runs scattered across the territory. On the ride home, with the last of the light going behind the hills to the west, Cole said, You did well tonight. I just told the truth. That's what doing well looks like. She thought about the faces in that yard. People who had been afraid for years and were still afraid, but who were willing, maybe, to be afraid together. Blackthorn's going to find out about this meeting, she said. Yes. And when he does, he's going to move. Yes, Cole said. Which means we need to move first. He looked at the dark hills ahead. I'm going to Crestwood this week. I'll talk to the lawyer. I'll find out what we're actually working with. I'll come. No. He said it firmly. Someone needs to be here. Blackthorn watches for opportunity. If we both leave, the property is vulnerable. He looked at her. I need to know this place is being watched. She knew he was right. She didn't like it. How long will you be gone? 3 days? Maybe 4. 3 days felt like a long time with a burned barn and a territory that had Victor Blackthorn in it. Be careful, she said. Always, he said, and it was the kind of always that meant he was aware it wasn't entirely true, but intended it to be. They rode the rest of the way in the dark, the horses knowing the trail well enough not to need much direction. And when the lights of the ranch came into view, small lights, just the 2 she'd left burning, Eliza felt something that took her a moment to name, because she hadn't felt it in long enough that she'd almost forgotten what it was. It was the feeling of having something to come home to. Not just land, not just her father's hammer and the repaired fence posts and the sound of the creek in the dark, something that was, slowly and imperfectly, and without any clear announcement, becoming hers in a new way. A way that included another person, which was the thing she hadn't planned for and which was, she was beginning to understand, the thing that made all of the rest of it matter differently. She unsaddled her horse and turned it loose in the corral and went inside and sat at the table with her father's ledger and added a new entry to the list. 7 families, 1 lawyer in Crestwood, a filing error on overlapping land claims, and 4 days to do what needed to be done before Blackthorn did it first. Cole came back from Crestwood on the 4th day, which was 1 day later than he'd said, and Eliza had spent that extra day doing the thing she'd promised herself she wouldn't do, which was standing at the window at intervals and watching the North Trail. She told herself it was practical vigilance. The burned barn frame was still visible from the window, and Blackthorn's men had been through twice in the past 3 days. Not doing anything, just riding the perimeter road at a pace that was meant to be seen. She had good reason to be watchful. She was also watching for Cole, and she knew it, and she found the knowing slightly irritating in the way that honest self-knowledge sometimes is. He rode in just before noon on the 4th day, looking like a man who hadn't slept much and had ridden hard to make up the time. His horse needed water immediately, and he saw to that before anything else, which she had come to recognize as one of his consistent qualities. He always dealt with the animal's needs before his own, without ceremony. The way people do things that are simply part of how they're built. She had coffee ready when he came inside. He sat down and drank half of it before he spoke. "The lawyer's name is Aldous Webb," he said. "He's 62. He's been practicing property law in Crestwood for 30 years, and he has a face that looks like someone sat on it, but he's sharp." He set the cup down. "I laid out everything we have. The filing overlap, the water redirection, the fence incidents, the arson report, the survey work Margaret Harmon found, all of it. And?" He said individually, "None of it's enough. The filing overlap is a procedural error that can be explained away. The water situation is hard to prove was deliberate without testimony from someone involved in doing it. The arson report is our word against nothing, filed with a sheriff who's likely to lose the paperwork." He looked at her. "But he also said that the pattern, documented together and presented as a coordinated campaign, is a different legal matter. It's the difference between individual incidents and a scheme, and schemes have different legal exposure." For Blackthorn. For Blackthorn and for Ferris, his lawyer, who has been knowingly filing the land claims as part of it. He paused. Webb said if we can establish that Ferris knew the claims were being used to pressure existing landowners rather than for legitimate settlement purposes, that's attorney misconduct. That's something the territorial bar takes seriously because it threatens the integrity of every other land filing in the system. Eliza sat with that. "So we need documentation of the pattern. We need every incident written down with dates, witnesses where we have them, and physical evidence where it exists." He reached into his coat and produced several folded papers. "Webb gave me a framework, what he needs, in what form, in what order." She took the papers. They were dense with detail, specific in their requirements, written in the handwriting of a man who had done this before and knew exactly what courts needed and what they didn't. He's willing to take the case. He's willing to evaluate it formally once we've assembled the documentation. He won't commit until he sees the full picture. Cole looked at her. He also said something else. The way he said it made her look up. He said we should expect escalation when Blackthorn realizes we're building something, and he will realize it, probably sooner than we'd like. His response is going to be fast, and it's going to be designed to break the group apart before it solidifies. Cole's voice was level, but there was something underneath it. He's seen this before, specifically this. Someone like Blackthorn, when they feel resistance organizing, they don't hit the center. They hit the edges. The people who are least committed, most afraid. They make examples. To scare the others back into line. Yes. She thought about the 7 faces in Briggs's yard. Garrett, who'd said yes last and meant it least. Solon's older son who'd talked about the land they'd already lost. Who does he go after first? The weakest link, Cole said, which in any group is usually the person who said yes while their body was saying no. Garrett, that's my read. She stood up and went to the window, the burned barn frame, the new fence posts on the south line, the creak she could hear on quiet mornings. We need to get to Garrett before Blackthorn does. We need to do more than that. Cole came to stand beside her. We need to make sure every one of those 7 people understands what's coming and has made an actual decision. Not a frightened yes in a yard full of neighbors, but a real decision, made alone, knowing what it might cost. Some of them will change their minds. Some of them will. Better to know now than to find out when it matters. He looked at the burned frame. Webb also mentioned that if we can get Margaret Harmon's notebook, the one with the survey numbers, that could be significant. Not because of what's in it necessarily, but because it establishes that Blackthorn's men were doing unauthorized survey work on her property. That's trespass at minimum. And if the numbers correspond to filings Ferris made afterward, then there's a direct line between the trespass and the legal strategy. Exactly. Eliza turned from the window. I'll go see Margaret. I'll go with you. No, she almost didn't let us in the last time. 2 people felt like pressure to her. I'll go alone. She looked at him. You go see Garrett. He thought about it. All right. And Cole. She met his eyes. Don't convince him. Just talk to him honestly. If he's going to fold when Blackthorn pushes, better he folds now than in 3 weeks. I know, he said. I've never wanted frightened soldiers. They're a danger to everyone, including themselves. It was said simply, and it landed simply, and it reminded her again of the parts of him she still didn't fully know. The history that came out in the specific way he said certain things. The marshal's knowledge of how people behave under pressure. The memory of that town he'd left and the weight he still carried from it. She put on her coat. Outside it had gone cold in the way early autumn went cold in the territory. Abrupt, like a door closing. Margaret Harmon's property sat at the end of a long access road bordered on both sides by land that now had Blackthorn's name on the deed. Eliza noticed that as she rode in, the surveyor's stakes on either side, the small flags that marked the new ownership boundaries. Margaret was surrounded now. That was not an accident. The woman came to the door before Eliza reached it, which meant she'd been watching from inside. She was smaller than Eliza remembered, or perhaps not smaller, but she held herself differently now. Contracted inward somehow, the way people look when they've spent months trying to take up less space. I was wondering if you'd come back, Margaret said. May I come in? A pause. Then she stepped aside. The inside of the house was neat in the way of a person who had reduced their life to what was manageable. Less furniture than there had probably been. Gaps on shelves. The marks of a woman who had sold what she didn't absolutely need and was living inside what remained. I heard about your barn, Margaret said, putting the kettle on without asking. News travels. Everything travels in this territory. That's always been Blackthorn's advantage. She set 2 cups out. He doesn't have to do much. People see what happens to those who resist and they tell each other. The telling does half his work for him. That's a clear-eyed way to see it. I've had months to think about it. Margaret sat down across from her. The kettle wasn't boiling yet, but she sat as if she needed to be sitting for what came next. You want the notebook? Eliza didn't hedge. Yes. I told your husband I wasn't sure if I could find it. I know. Margaret looked at the table. I told him that because I needed time to decide. Not because I didn't know where it was. She looked up. I've known exactly where it was since the day I found it. I put it in the flour tin in the back of the pantry because that was the one place I knew Blackthorn's men would never look. They came back 3 days after the one who dropped it. Looking for it. Searched the barn, the equipment shed, the perimeter. Didn't come inside. She paused. I think they assumed it had blown into the creek. Eliza was very still. I kept it because I thought someday it might matter, Margaret said. And then I sold the land and I thought, what does it matter now? The land's gone. What can a notebook do? She looked at the window and the Blackthorn-marked stakes visible down the access road. But it doesn't go away. That's the thing I've learned. Whatever's wrong doesn't go away just because you stop looking at it. No, Eliza said quietly. It doesn't. Margaret got up and went to the pantry. Eliza heard the movement of things being shifted, a tin being lifted, the sound of paper. When she came back, she was holding a small notebook, the kind used for field notes, with a water-stained cover and pages that had dried slightly warped. She set it on the table between them. Eliza didn't pick it up yet. If you give me this, Blackthorn will eventually know it came from you. It will lead back here. I know. He could make things difficult for you, more difficult. Margaret looked at her steadily. I already sold him my land, Eliza. What I have left is what I did or didn't do with what I knew. A beat. I'm not a brave woman. I want to be honest about that. But I've been sitting here for months knowing I was holding something that might matter and telling myself it didn't. She pushed the notebook forward slightly. Take it. Eliza picked it up. She opened it carefully. The pages were dense with numbers, coordinates, notations in a handwriting that was small and precise. Survey coordinates, boundary measurements, dates. And at the top of each entry, a property name. She recognized 4 of the names immediately. 3 of them were properties of families who had already sold. One of them was her own ranch. The surveys had been done 2 years ago, before the pressure started, before the fences were cut and the water was redirected. These surveys had come first, the reconnaissance before the campaign. She closed the notebook. "Can I ask you something?" Eliza said. "Yes." "If things had been different, if there had been others, a group, people who would have stood with you, would you have sold?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "No," she said finally. "I wouldn't have." She looked at her hands on the table. "That's the thing I keep coming back to. I didn't sell because I wanted to. I sold because I believed I was the only one, and alone I couldn't survive it." She looked up. "Don't let the others believe they're alone." Garrett had already had a visitor by the time Cole arrived. He could tell from the way the man came to the door. Tighter, faster, the controlled movement of someone who'd been unsettled and was trying not to show it. Cole had been a marshal long enough to read the body the way other people read faces. "I've got company," Cole said. "Had," Garrett said. "He's gone." "Blackthorn's man." Garrett didn't deny it. He stepped aside and let Cole in, which was something. The inside of Garrett's house was a working man's house. Tools on the table, half a harness being mended on the chair, the smell of coffee that had been on too long. Garrett picked up the harness and moved it without being asked, and Cole sat down. "What did he say?" Cole asked. "That there are troublemakers in the territory stirring up people who'd be better off taking fair offers and moving on." Garrett said it in the flat tone of a man repeating something he'd been told to believe. Said there are legal ways to challenge what's happening, and those challenges are going to be messy and expensive and are likely to fail. He sat down. Said he knew about the meeting at Briggs's. Cole let that settle without visible reaction, though he noted it carefully. Blackthorn had known about the meeting within. How many days? 3? 4? Someone had talked, or someone had been watching. What else? Said that people who get out now, cleanly, would get better terms than people who cause trouble and get out later. Garrett looked at his hands. He had numbers. Better than what Blackthorn offered before. Noticeably better. "That's not generosity," Cole said. "That's the price of your silence while the others are dealt with." Garrett looked up at that. "He's offering you more because he wants you to leave the group before it does anything effective," Cole continued. "The offer goes away once the legal challenge is filed. Or it gets smaller. He needs you out now, while you can still be used as evidence that reasonable people took fair deals." "And what do I get if I stay in the group? A legal fight I can't afford that might not go anywhere." "You get the chance that it does go somewhere." Cole looked at him steadily. "I'm not going to tell you the odds are certain. They're not. The law is slow, and it costs money, and Blackthorn has more resources than we do. Those things are true." A pause. "What's also true is that Aldous Webb in Crestwood looked at what we have and said it was worth pursuing. A man who's practiced property law for 30 years doesn't say that unless he means it." Garrett was quiet. He picked up the harness and turned it in his hands, not mending it, just holding it. "My father built this place," he said, 40 years ago. "He came here with nothing, and he built it, and he gave it to me, and I have not added a single acre to it. I have only tried to hold what he left." He set the harness down. "Blackthorn's offer would let me walk away clean. No debt. A little to live on." "Where would you go?" "I don't know." "You'd go somewhere else and start with less than you have now, and you'd know for the rest of your life that you gave up what your father built cost too much to keep." Cole said it without cruelty, just plainly. "That's not a judgment. That's the reality of the choice." Garrett's jaw tightened. "You're not making this easy." "It's not easy. Easy. I'm not going to pretend it is." He leaned forward slightly. "What I can tell you is this. We have documentation now that we didn't have before. We have a notebook that shows Blackthorn's men surveyed your property, and 7 others, without permission, 2 years before the pressure started. That's not an isolated incident. That's a plan. And plans, when they're documented, become evidence." Garrett looked at him. "How sure are you?" "Sure enough that I rode 4 days to Crestwood and back. Sure enough that I came here today before going anywhere else. He held the man's gaze. Not certain. Certain isn't a thing I can offer you, but I believe in what we're building and I believe you belong in it. The kitchen was quiet for a long moment. I'll stay, Garrett said finally. The word came out like something that had been held for too long and needed the release. But I want it on record that I'm terrified. That's the most honest thing anyone said to me in weeks, Cole said. And it's fine. Terrified people can still make good decisions. Garrett almost smiled. That's a low bar. It's a real one. Wow. The second meeting was held not at Briggs's property, but at the Solon Ranch, at the suggestion of Solon's older son, whose name was David, and who had emerged over the past 2 weeks as the kind of person who thinks 3 steps ahead and doesn't announce it. The most useful kind of person in any group trying to accomplish something difficult. Webb, the Crestwood lawyer, attended by correspondence, a long letter read aloud by Cole that laid out the legal strategy in plain language, step by step, without condescension and without false optimism. It said what was needed, what it would cost, what the realistic timelines were, and what could go wrong. Eliza had appreciated that specifically. A lawyer who told you what could go wrong was more trustworthy than one who only told you what could go right. 9 people this time. 2 new faces, a cattle farmer named Orrin, who had driven 6 hours from the eastern edge of the territory after Briggs had reached him by letter, and a woman named Clara Tesh, who ran a small horse operation and had a litigation record herself, having once successfully fought a water rights dispute in the county court 2 years before Blackthorn began his expansion. Clara Tesh was the most valuable person in the room, and she knew it and wasn't precious about it. She sat next to Eliza and read Webb's letter over her shoulder and then said, "His argument about Ferris is the strongest angle. The rest is circumstantial at the level it's at, but attorney misconduct is different. It's cleaner. Courts move faster on it." That's what Webb said. Webb's right. I've dealt with land claim challenges, and they can take years. Attorney misconduct cases sometimes move in months. She tapped the letter. If he can establish that Ferris knew about the survey trespass and filed claims on those same parcels afterward, that's a direct chain. Judge sees that chain, everything else becomes context for a pattern. How do we establish what Ferris knew? Clara thought about it. Does anyone in this room have any interaction with Ferris directly? Anyone he communicated with during any of this? Silence. Then Orrin, the eastern cattle farmer, said, "He came to my property once, about 18 months ago. Said he was doing a routine boundary verification for the county. I let him walk the east fence line." His voice was flat with retrospective anger. "He wasn't doing any county business, was he?" "No," Cole said. "He wasn't." "Do you remember the date?" Clara asked. "Roughly. I can check against my cattle records. I keep a log of every workday and who came to the property." "That log is documentation," Clara said. "That's Ferris on your property, representing a county affiliation he didn't have, on a date that will correlate with land filings made afterward. That's misrepresentation. That adds to the misconduct chain." The room had changed. Eliza could feel it. The shift from people who were afraid and trying to organize towards something to people who could see, concretely, how the pieces fit together. It was not confidence exactly. It was more like the specific clarity that comes when a problem that has seemed overwhelming breaks into its component parts, and the parts become, individually, manageable. She stood up. "We need 3 things from this meeting. First, everyone who had any contact with Ferris or anyone else representing Blackthorn's interests writes it down. Date, location, what was said, what they claim to be doing. Second, we agree on the funding amount for Webb, split across whoever's in. Third, we agree to tell each other immediately if Blackthorn approaches any one of us with an offer or a threat." She looked around the room, not to create panic, so that we know what he knows and when. "He already knows about this group," Garrett said. It was the first time he'd spoken in the meeting. "His man came to see me 4 days ago." The room absorbed that. "And you're still here," David Solon said. "I'm still here," Garrett said. Something passed between the group then. Not spoken, just present. The acknowledgement that Garrett had been tested and had stayed, and that this mattered. "He's going to escalate," Cole said. He said it to the room, not to any one person. "I want to be honest with everyone here. The fact that he sent someone to Garrett means he knows more than we'd like him to know, and it means he's taking this seriously. When Blackthorn takes something seriously, he doesn't back down. He increases pressure. A beat. What that looks like, I can't say exactly, but it won't be quiet, and it's likely to come soon. What do we do? Someone asked from the back. We finish what we're building before he does what he's planning, Eliza said. It was simple as that, and everyone in the room understood it. The week that followed was the busiest of Eliza's life, which was saying something for a woman who had been working a failing ranch alone for 3 months. They worked on the documentation during the day, she and Cole at the kitchen table, assembling the entries from everyone who'd written them down, building the chronological record that Webb had specified. It was painstaking work, and it required a specific patience, the patience of building something that would only matter if it was complete and correct. Cole had a system for it. He'd lay out the pages in order and read each one aloud, and she would cross-reference against the land filing dates he'd copied from the territorial records in Crestwood, and together they built a timeline that was, as it accumulated, quietly devastating in what it showed. The first unauthorized survey, 18 months before the first family sold. Ferris's visit to Orrin's property, 14 months ago. The first water interference, simultaneous with the first round of offers. The fence-cutting incidents, escalating in frequency precisely when offers were refused. And beneath all of it, the filing dates, parcels claimed by Blackthorn within weeks of each survey, each trespass, each visit. It was not a series of accidents. It was a schedule. He's been running this for at least 2 years, Eliza said, looking at the finished timeline on the evening of the 4th day. Probably longer. This is what we can document. The actual start was likely earlier. Cole looked at the pages. Ferris designed the legal framework first. Then Blackthorn used it, which is why Webb says the misconduct angle is strongest. Ferris isn't a bystander who happened to benefit. He's an architect. Can we send this to Webb? Tomorrow. I'll ride to Crestwood and deliver it in person. I want to walk through it with him, not just send papers. He looked at her. 3 days this time. She nodded. I'll be all right. I know you will. He said it without flattery, just as a fact about her that he'd established by watching her and believed. She looked at the timeline on the table. All those dates and names and incidents, all those individual moments of fear and pressure and loss that had seemed, when they were happening, to be weather, random, personal, each family's private bad luck. Set out in order like this, they were something else entirely. My father went through some of this, she said, the early part. The first fence incidents, the first time the water dropped. He didn't know what it was. He thought it was the territory being hard, which it always is. She touched one of the pages. He died not knowing it was deliberate. Cole was quiet. I'm glad he didn't know, she said. He would have tried to fight it alone and it would have killed him faster. She took her hand off the page. I'm also angry about it, that he carried all that and didn't know what it was. That anger's useful, Cole said quietly. I know. She looked at him. It's been useful since the beginning. It's what got me out of bed the morning after he died, when everything else said, stay down. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, briefly, the way people touch when words are insufficient. Not as a gesture, not as a performance, just as presence. Then he moved his hand back. Get some sleep, he said. Big days ahead. 3 days later, 2 things happened simultaneously, which was the kind of timing that made Eliza believe, not in fate, but in the specific malice of powerful men who watched and waited for the right moment. The first thing, a writer came from Webb in Crestwood with a letter saying he'd reviewed the timeline, the notebook, Orrin's log, and the corroborating filing dates, and that he was prepared to file a formal misconduct complaint with the territorial bar on behalf of the group and to initiate a challenge to the overlapping land claims. The letter said the timeline was as strong as he'd hoped. He used the word compelling, which Cole said was not a word Webb used lightly. The second thing, Victor Blackthorn rode onto the Voss property for the first time since the morning he'd dropped his offer in the dust. He came with 4 men this time instead of 6, and he dismounted, which was new. He took off his hat, which was also new. The performance of civility was so deliberate it was almost more insulting than the open contempt had been. Mrs. Maverick, he said. She had not fully gotten used to the name yet. She noticed the way he used it, the deliberateness of it, the acknowledgement that her status had changed since the last time they'd spoken. He was recalibrating. Mr. Blackthorne. He looked around the property, at the new fence line, at the footprint of the rebuilt barn structure, the fresh lumber from Morrison's mill that Cole had begun framing 3 weeks ago. At the general evidence of a property that was not dying, which she could see displeased him in a way he was controlling carefully. I understand there's been some organizing among the smaller operations in the territory, he said. Some meetings, some talk about legal challenges. She waited. I want you to know I hold no ill will about any of that, he said. People are frightened. People make decisions out of fear that they might make differently with better information. He turned his hat in his hands, an almost human gesture, except that it was too practiced. I'm a businessman. I'm not in the business of fighting neighbors. You're in the business of owning them, she said. Something moved behind his eyes. Quick, controlled. That's not fair. 17 families, Mr. Blackthorne. 15 who sold after having their water interfered with, their fences cut, their animals harmed. 2 who didn't sell because we found out what was happening and stopped it. She looked at him steadily. I have the dates. I have the survey records. I have the filing history. She paused. And I have a lawyer in Crestwood who finds it very interesting. The 4 men behind him had gone very still. Blackthorne looked at her for a long moment. The civility performance had worn thin. Not gone, but the edges of it were showing, the structure underneath visible the way old paint shows what's beneath when the weather gets at it. Whatever you think you have, he said, and his voice was quieter now, which was worse. It would be better for everyone involved to settle this quietly. I can be generous. You've been generous before. Margaret Harmon could tell you what that generosity looked like from the inside. He put his hat back on, slow, deliberate. Think carefully, he said. Before you make this something, it doesn't need to be. It's already what it is, she said. It became what it is the day your men redirected my creek and then came back and burned my barn. The day your lawyer walked onto Orenbeel's property, claiming county business he wasn't authorized to conduct. She stepped forward 1 step, just one, but it changed the geometry of the conversation. You should think carefully, Mr. Blackthorne, because what I have is already in Crestwood, and it's already on paper, and paper doesn't burn as easy as barns do. Blackthorne looked at her for 3 full seconds. She counted them. And then he turned and walked back to his horse and mounted and rode off his 4 men behind him. And she stood in the yard and watched him go and did not move until the last of his dust had settled. Then she sat down on the porch steps because her legs had decided they'd been steady for long enough. Her hands were shaking slightly. She let them shake. There was nobody there to see it, and it seemed, given everything, a reasonable response. After a few minutes, the shaking stopped. She stood up, went inside, and wrote down the date and time and everything that had been said, because that was what you did with encounters like that. You recorded them, every word you could remember, and you put them on paper, and paper was what was going to matter. Through the window, she could see the framing of the new barn going up, the creek running where it was supposed to run, the fence line that someone had tried to erase and that was standing now, straight and deliberate, like an argument that refused to be finished. She wrote until her hand hurt. Then she folded the pages and put them with the others. The pile on the table was thick now, thick enough to matter, thick enough that a man in Crestwood had called it compelling. She put her hand flat on top of it and felt, for the first time since all of this began, something that was adjacent to hope. Not the fragile, wishful kind, but the earned kind, the kind that comes from work and documentation and the slow construction of a case that has real weight to it. It was not over. She knew that. Blackthorne's quiet departure was not surrender. It was assessment. He was going back to recalculate, and the recalculation was going to produce something, and whatever it produced was going to be aimed at everything she'd built. But she'd built it knowing that. She'd built it for exactly that. She went to put the kettle on and wait for Cole to come home. Cole came back to find the record of Blackthorne's visit written out in 4 pages of Eliza's careful handwriting on the kitchen table, and he read it standing up without taking his coat off, which told her what she needed to know about how seriously he was taking it. He set the pages down. He came himself. In person, 4 men. He doesn't do that. Cole finally took his coat off, hung it on the peg by the door. He sends people. He's been sending people since the beginning. He came himself because something changed. Webb filing the misconduct complaint. Word travels fast in legal circles, even between counties. He sat down. Webb filed 2 days ago. Blackthorne probably knew within 24 hours. He looked at the pages again. He came to see if you'd blink. I didn't. I know, I read it. He looked at her across the table. You told him about the papers already being in Crestwood. I did. That was the right call. It removes his option of making this disappear quietly before it reaches anyone who matters. A pause. It also means he knows the quiet phase is over. She'd known that when she said it. She'd said it anyway, standing in the yard with her legs already planning to give out on her, because it had seemed in that moment like the truest and most necessary thing to say. What does the non-quiet phase look like? Cole was quiet for long enough that she felt it. Tell me, she said. Webb's misconduct complaint goes to the territorial bar. That process takes weeks at minimum, possibly longer. In that time, Blackthorn can't stop the formal process. It's out of his reach, assuming the bar has any integrity, which Webb believes it does. But he can make the case harder to prosecute by attacking the evidence and the witnesses. He looked at the table. Not legally, the other way. He goes after the people who gave statements. He goes after the most exposed ones, the ones who are already struggling, who have the least margin to absorb more pressure. He turned his cup in his hands. Oren is 60 miles away, which gives him some protection. Clara Tesh has her own litigation record and knows how to protect herself legally. Garrett is the one I'm worried about. And Briggs. Briggs is stubborn enough that it might not matter how hard they push, but Garrett, he exhaled. Garrett said yes because he believed in what we were doing, but he's operating on thin margins. If Blackthorn's men do to his operation what they did to ours, he might not survive it long enough for the case to resolve. Eliza thought about Garrett's hands on the harness he'd been mending, the 40 years his father had put into that land. What do we do? We move faster than he does, and we make sure that everyone who's given a statement knows to document everything, every approach, every offer, every act of pressure, and gets it to Webb immediately. He looked at her. Webb also sent something back with me. He reached into his coat and produced a letter, which he handed across the table. It was 2 pages, dense, in the same precise handwriting as the framework document he'd brought before. She read it carefully. Twice. He says the bar has agreed to a preliminary review, she said. Within the month. That's fast for them. Faster than Webb expected. Cole's voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before, something careful and contained that she identified, after a moment, as the controlled version of relief. Someone on the bar committee apparently had their own dealings with Ferris 20 years ago. Nothing actionable, just professional unease. Webb said it was mentioned in passing when he filed. So Ferris has a history. A long one. Careful enough to never cross a clear line, but the bar remembers. He leaned back. This doesn't guarantee anything. A preliminary review isn't a finding, but it means there's institutional attention on Ferris now, which means Ferris is going to be careful about what he does next. Can Blackthorn operate without Ferris? He can operate, but not the way he has been. The legal framework Ferris built, the preemptive claims, the manufactured title disputes, that requires someone who knows property law well enough to walk the edge of it. Without Ferris actively running it, the machine slows down. He looked at her. Which is exactly why Blackthorn's going to do something physical instead. Something that doesn't require legal maneuvering. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up, moving through the lumber stacked for the barn reconstruction, making the boards shift and settle. How much time do we have? She said. Days? Maybe less? He said it plainly, without softening it. I'd rather tell you straight than have you unprepared. She nodded. Then we spend tonight planning. They were at the table until past midnight, which was something they hadn't done before. Working that late, that close, the lamp between them throwing the kind of light that makes the rest of the world feel very far away, and the thing right in front of you very immediate. Cole had brought back a detailed map of the territory from Crestwood, surveyor grade, which he spread across the table and waited at the corners with the flour tin and her father's ledger and 2 coffee cups. He'd marked the locations of all 9 properties in the group, Blackthorn's main operation, the access roads, the natural features. He has men housed here and here, Cole said, indicating 2 points. Based on what I've been able to piece together from talking to people in town, he keeps 8 to 12 armed men at any given time. Not all of them are willing to do serious harm. Some are just ranch hands who like steady pay. But some of them are men he brought in specifically for enforcement, and those are a different category. How do you know which is which? The ranch hands avoid eye contact in town. They're uncomfortable. The enforcement men don't avoid anything. They watch everything. He tapped the map. I've identified 4 who fit that description. 2 I recognize by reputation from when I was marshalling. Neither of them has a clean history. And Dolan is still useless. Dolan is worse than useless. He's a liability. If something happens and we call on him, he tells Blackthorn before he tells anyone else. He traced a line on the map. Which means if Blackthorn moves against any of the group's properties, we can't rely on legal authority to respond in time. We have to be the response. She looked at the map, at the 9 properties scattered across the territory, the distances between them, the roads that connected them. 9 properties. We can't defend all of them at once. No, which is why we need to predict where he starts. Cole studied the map. He's not going to move on us first. We're the most visible, and I'm a complication he'd rather neutralize through isolation than direct confrontation. He'll go for someone who seems more vulnerable, someone whose statement to Webb was damaging. He put his finger on Oren's property to the east. Oren's the problem for him. Oren's log puts Ferris on his property under false pretenses. That's the cleanest piece of the misconduct case. But Oren's 60 miles away. 60 miles is nothing if you're motivated and you move at night. He looked at her. I need to ride to Oren's tomorrow. I need to make sure he's not standing there alone, not knowing what's coming. I'll send word to the others while you're gone. Through David Solon. He's the fastest rider, and Blackthorn's people don't watch him as closely as they watch us. Cole nodded. Tell them no unnecessary travel. Everyone stays on their own property for the next 2 weeks if possible. Anyone who has to go to town goes with another member of the group. He looked up from the map. And I need Garrett to agree to have someone with him. I don't want him alone. He's going to resist that. I know. Tell him it's practical, not protective. Tell him we need eyes on his property, and he can't provide eyes and work his ranch simultaneously. He almost smiled. He'll accept it better as a task than as help. She almost smiled back. They were learning each other, she realized. The edges and angles, the specific ways each of them needed things framed. It was the kind of knowledge that accumulates quietly. And then one day you realize it's there, thick enough to matter. Cole, she said. Yeah. If this goes wrong, it's not going to go wrong. But if it does, she held his gaze. I want you to know that whatever happens with the case, with the land, with any of it, what you've done here already matters. What you came back to try to do, the thing you didn't do before. You're doing it. He looked at her for a moment. I'm not sure I deserve credit for correcting a mistake. You corrected it. That's not nothing. She looked at the map, the 9 points of light in the dark of the territory. Get some sleep. Long ride tomorrow. She rode to Garrett's herself the next morning, while Cole went east toward Oren. Garrett met her at the fence line. He'd been watching, which was a good sign, a sign that he understood the territory had changed. He looked older than he had at the first meeting, which was only 3 weeks ago. Fear does that, compresses time and wears the face. She told him plainly what Cole had told her, that Blackthorn was likely to move within days, that Garrett's property was a possible target, that they needed someone else present. You're saying I need a babysitter, he said. I'm saying you need a witness, she said. Someone who can see and report what happens. You can't watch your own property and do everything else it requires simultaneously. That's not weakness, it's geometry. He chewed on that. Who? David Solon offered. He's steady and he knows how to stay out of the way while being useful. Garrett looked at his land, the fences, the pasture where his sheep were grazing in their particular unhurried way. I hate this, he said, all of it. I've been on this land 40 years and I've never had to ask anyone to stand guard. I know. Your father never had to do this either. My father's generation had different problems. Not easier. Different. She looked at him steadily. He would have done what was necessary. That's what you're doing. Garrett was quiet. Then, tell Solon to come Tuesday, and tell him I'm not feeding him. He brings his own provisions. Eliza kept her expression neutral. I'll tell him. The attack when it came was not where Cole had predicted. It was not Oren. It was not Garrett. It was Tom Briggs, whose stubbornness Cole had judged correctly as a kind of protection, but whose isolated position on the territory's northern edge made him accessible in a way they hadn't fully weighted. They came at 3 a.m, not with fire this time, something more targeted. Briggs's sheep fence on the northern pasture, a half-mile of it, was cut, and the sheep were driven out into the open territory before he was awake to stop it. By the time he came out and understood what was happening, he'd lost maybe 40 animals to the dark and the terrain, scattered in directions he couldn't track until daylight. He sent a rider to the Voss ranch at dawn, and the rider arrived at the same time Cole was returning from Orin's, 2 days of hard riding on him, his horse lathered, and he heard the message and turned around without going inside. Eliza caught his arm. "You haven't slept." "I'll sleep when I get there." He looked at her. "Come with me." "Both of us?" "I know. But this is the moment where it either holds or it doesn't, and it holds better if you're there." He was exhausted in a way she could see through the controlled surface of him, the specific rawness that comes from 2 days of hard riding and no sleep. "Briggs needs to see that we showed up. That's what this is about right now. Not tactics, just presence." She went with him. They found Briggs on foot in the northern pasture with 2 of his neighbors from the meeting, all 3 of them moving through the dry grass trying to find and count the scattered animals. He was not the controlled man who'd met them at his gate weeks ago. I was the version of himself that exists underneath control. When control has been stripped away by 3 in the morning and 40 missing sheep, and the specific violence of watching something you've spent years building get taken apart in one dark hour. Cole didn't say much. He tied his horse and started walking the fence line, looking at the cuts, reading how they'd been done and from which direction. Eliza went to Briggs and stood next to him and didn't say anything useful because there wasn't anything useful to say right then. She just stood there, which was what Cole had meant about presence. After about 10 minutes, Briggs said quietly, to no one in particular, "I'm so tired of being afraid." "I know," she said. "I've been afraid since this started. I'm afraid right now. I've been afraid every morning when I come out to check the fence and every night when I hear something outside and I don't know if it's wind or something else." He was looking at the open pasture, the gap in the fence, the dark beyond it. "I said yes at the meeting because I was angry enough to say yes, but underneath that I've been terrified the whole time." "That's not weakness," she said. It was what Cole had said about Garrett, and she meant it just as straightforwardly. It doesn't feel like strength. It doesn't have to feel like strength. It just has to be what you do anyway. She looked at him. "How many animals did you lose?" 43 that I can count missing. Maybe more." His voice caught on it slightly, then steadied. 2 years of careful breeding in some of those animals. Cole came back across the pasture. 3 men, he said. 2 came in from the north on horseback, 1 on foot through the eastern side. They knew the fence layout. They cut the sections that would cause maximum scatter with minimum noise. He looked at Briggs. "This wasn't random. They knew your operation." "Ferris," Briggs said. The name came out like something he was spitting. "Most likely. The survey trespass he did wasn't just about property boundaries. It was reconnaissance. He'd have noted the pasture layout, the fence structure, the animal concentration points." Cole's voice was even, which Eliza had learned meant he was angrier than he sounded. He gave them a map. The 3 of them stood in the torn pasture in the early morning light, and the weight of that settled on all of them. "What do we do?" Briggs asked. "We find as many animals as we can today. All of us, the whole group. I'll send word. Everyone who can ride comes here today to help search." Cole looked at him. "And we write it down. Date, time, method, estimated losses. It goes to Webb by tomorrow morning." "It's not going to give me back the sheep." "No. But it adds to the case that's going to end this." Cole held the man's gaze. "The attack on your operation tonight is exactly what Webb said to watch for. It's Blackthorn trying to break the group by making examples. We respond by documenting it and continuing." Briggs looked at the fence gap, at the sky above the northern territory where his sheep were scattered somewhere in the early morning dark. "Continuing," he repeated, like he was testing the word to see if it still held meaning. "Continuing," Cole said. 8 people came to Briggs's property by midday. Not everyone from the group. Orrin couldn't make it from 60 miles, and one of the smaller operators had a sick child. But 8 people, including David Solon and Clara Tesh and Garrett, who came on horseback with his provisions packed as though he'd been planning to come regardless of the summons. They spread out across the northern territory in pairs and spent most of the day walking terrain and calling and herding, the particular unglamorous work of recovering scattered livestock, which requires patience and a willingness to cover the same ground multiple times, and not give up before the last animal is found. By the end of the afternoon, they had recovered 31 of the 43. 12 were still out there somewhere. Briggs had stopped counting and started just working, which was probably the right thing. Clara Tesh, who had said almost nothing all day, came to stand next to Eliza near the water trough as the light was going. "He's escalating faster than I expected," she said. "Cole thought we had days." "We had 2 days." Clara looked across the pasture. "Webb needs to know the timeline is compressing. The bar review is in 3 weeks. If Blackthorn can dismantle the group before that review happens—" "He can't," Eliza said. Clara looked at her. "He can hurt us. He can cost us animals and sleep and weeks of work. But he cannot dismantle this group because this group has already filed its documentation, and the documentation is in Crestwood, and the bar is already looking at Ferris." She felt the steadiness in herself as she said it. Not bravado, just the bedrock fact of it. The only thing he can do now is make noise while the process runs. And if he makes enough noise in the process of it, he adds to the evidence. Clara was quiet for a moment. "You've thought about this a lot." "Every night since the barn." Eliza looked at the recovered sheep settling in the near pasture. "When something's burning in front of you, you can watch it burn or you can think about what comes after. I started thinking about what comes after." "And what does come after?" "Webb files. The bar reviews. Ferris gets investigated and probably sanctioned. The land claims get challenged. Blackthorn loses his legal architecture." She paused. "He might keep some of what he took. That's the hard part. The families who already sold, some of those situations are complicated to reverse. But he doesn't get to keep taking, and he doesn't get to do it this way again." Clara nodded slowly. "And the people who lost the most?" "That's the thing that doesn't have a clean resolution." Eliza didn't look away from it. "Margaret sold. Some of the others sold. The land's gone. What we can do is make sure it's documented why they sold, under what conditions, with what pressure applied, so that the record is honest even if the situation can't be fully undone." She thought of Margaret's face when she'd handed over the notebook. Whatever I did or didn't do with what I knew. A woman trying to keep the ledger of her own life honest. "Let's get inside," Clara said. "Briggs is making coffee, which is the most optimistic thing I've seen all day." The next 2 weeks were the worst and most clarifying of the whole thing. Blackthorn moved twice more. A section of fencing on Garrett's east boundary, done with the same efficiency as the Briggs attack. Quiet, targeted, maximum disruption. And a water interference at the Solon Ranch, pulling from the same playbook they'd used on the Voss property months ago. The Berman Channel redirect that Cole had become expert at identifying and reversing. Each time they documented. Each time the documentation went to Webb within 24 hours. Each time the group showed up. Fewer people some days, more on others, but always showing up. Garrett let David Solon stay for the duration, and by the end of the second week the two of them had developed the kind of efficient working partnership that emerges between people who've had to depend on each other in practical ways. Cole slept 4 hours some nights and 6 on the best ones. Eliza watched the hollows under his eyes deepen and said nothing about it because he would have said he was fine, and they both would have known that was only partially true. She was running on something similar herself. Not quite fear, not quite adrenaline, something that lived between them, a state of sustained alertness that felt like it had become her default setting. On the night before the bar's preliminary review, they sat on the porch in the cold and looked at the territory in the dark. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow Webb presents to the review committee. It'll take time after that. The committee deliberates. They may ask for additional documentation. The process has its own pace." He looked at the stars, which were sharp in the cold the way they get when the air is thin and dry. "But tomorrow is the first official crack in the wall. Do you think it's enough?" He considered the question honestly, which she'd come to expect from him. The misconduct case against Ferris is strong. The pattern documentation is strong. The correlation between the survey trespass and the subsequent filings is strong. He paused. Whether it's enough depends on people and institutions doing what they're supposed to do, which doesn't always happen. That's not reassuring. No, but it's true. He looked at her. What I know is that we've built the strongest case we could with what we had. We've done it correctly and thoroughly and on record. If it fails, it won't be because we didn't do everything that was possible. She looked at the dark. at the outline of the rebuilt barn structure, the new timber pale against the night sky, going up steadily from the footprint where the old one had burned, at the south fence line holding steady where it had been cut and recut, at the place where the creek ran in its correct channel, water moving where water was supposed to move. Cole. Yeah. When this is over. She stopped, started again. I've been thinking about what I said, about what you want, and I realize I told you to answer and then didn't tell you the same thing. She kept her eyes on the dark. I want this. The ranch, and the work, and the group of people we've built. And I want... She paused, precisely enough that it was its own kind of sentence. I want you to stay. Not because of the arrangement, because of what this has become. He was quiet for long enough that she turned to look at him. He was looking at her with an expression she'd seen on him once before, in the early morning after the barn fire, when he'd sat next to her in the ash and not tried to fill the silence. Present. Fully and simply present. I'm not going anywhere, he said. You haven't said that before. I know. He held her gaze. I'm saying it now. She held it for a moment, the weight of it, the simplicity and the sufficiency of it. All right, she said. All right, he said, the word between them again. But it had accumulated meaning with each use, and by now it held enough that it could carry what they weren't saying along with what they were. She went inside eventually, and he stayed on the porch a little longer, looking at the territory, at the fence lines and the creek and the dark hills to the north where Blackthorn's operations sat, where whatever was going to happen next was already being planned. He'd spent the past months rebuilding what other people had tried to take apart. He'd done it piece by piece, post by post, document by document, and there were days when it had felt like exactly as futile as it probably looked from the outside. But the fence was standing, the water was running, 9 families were still on their land who might not have been. And tomorrow, in a room in Crestwood, a 62-year-old lawyer with a face like someone had sat on it was going to lay out everything they'd built in front of people who had the authority to do something about it. Cole sat with that for another few minutes. Then he went inside, because there was nothing more to be done tonight, and tomorrow was going to require everything he had. The bar committee's preliminary review took 11 days. 11 days during which Eliza checked the mail each morning with the particular controlled expression of someone who has decided not to hope too visibly because visible hope is a thing that can be seen to fail. 11 days during which Cole continued the barn reconstruction, working methodically through the framing and the roofing because work was the only honest answer to waiting. 11 days during which Blackthorn went quiet in a way that was not reassuring, the quiet of a man recalculating rather than retreating. Webb's letter arrived on a Tuesday. She was at the water pump when Cole brought it out from the house, and she knew from the way he walked, not faster than usual but differently, with a quality of contained purpose, that it was something. She dried her hands and took the letter and read it standing there in the yard. The committee had found sufficient grounds to open a formal disciplinary investigation into Aldous Ferris. The investigation would be conducted by the Territorial Bar's Ethics Board, with findings expected within 60 days. Pending the investigation, Ferris had been advised to cease active legal work on all contested land matters in Red Hollow territory. Additionally, the committee had referred the overlapping land claim filings to the Territorial Land Office for independent audit. She read it twice. Then she handed it to Cole. He read it, set it down at his side. It's not over, he said. I know. 60 days minimum. The audit could take longer. Even after findings, Blackthorn will challenge whatever comes out of it. I know all of that. She looked at him. But Ferris has been told to stop. The claims are being audited. Someone with authority is looking at the machine. She paused. That's what we built toward. That's what the notebook and Oren's log and every dated page in that stack were for. He looked at the letter again. Yes, he said. It is. They stood there for a moment with the weight of it. Not celebration, because it wasn't that, but something real and earned that didn't need to be named loudly to be genuine. I need to ride to Briggs, she said, and Garrett, and the others. They should hear this today. I'll come with you. She shook her head. Finish the roof section. I'll take David. He knows all the routes. She looked at the barn, the new timber bright in the morning light, the structure rising steadily from the footprint of what had burned. I want the roof on before the rain comes. He looked at her for a moment. Then, Take a rifle. I always take a rifle. Take it loaded. She almost told him she always did that too, and then decided it wasn't the moment for it. I'll be back before dark. She wrote to 7 properties that day, and at each one she read the relevant parts of Webb's letter aloud. And at each one she watched a version of the same thing happen on a different face. The specific shift of a person who has been holding tension for so long that the first sign of release produces not relief, but a kind of careful disbelief. The wariness of people who have been let down before and can't fully trust good news until it's had time to prove itself. Garrett cried. He turned away before it was visible and composed himself before he turned back. But she'd seen it. She didn't mention it. She just waited while he poured them both coffee they didn't need and talked about the audit timeline in a steady voice, and she let him have the dignity of the recovery. Briggs said, "It's not my sheep back." "No," she said, "it's not. But it's something. It's the beginning of something, which is different from nothing." He nodded, stood at his fence line looking at the pasture where the recovered animals grazed alongside the 12 they'd never found. "You know what I think about sometimes," he said. "I think about the version of this where you sold, where you took Blackthorn's offer and left, and there was nobody to organize this." He looked at her. "I'd have sold by now. Without the group, I'd have sold." She held that. "You don't know that for certain." "I know myself," he said simply. It was honest in the way only people with some real self-knowledge can be honest, and she respected it. "Then I'm glad I didn't sell." "So am I," he said. 12 sheep and all. The formal investigation moved at the pace. Formal investigations move, which is slower than anyone involved would prefer, and faster than the people being investigated would like. Over the following weeks, the Ethics Board sent investigators to Red Hollow territory twice. They reviewed the documentation Webb had submitted, the timeline, the notebook, Oren's log, the corroborating filing dates, and they requested additional records from the Territorial Land Office and from the county surveyor's files, which produced, according to Webb's subsequent letters, more than anyone had expected to find. Ferris had been careful, but 30 years of careful leaves tracks if someone knows where to look, and the investigators apparently knew where to look. What emerged was not a single dramatic revelation, but an accumulation, the specific legal equivalent of everything they'd built from the human side. Unauthorized survey data used to prepare land filings. Filings submitted on behalf of clients before the surveyed property was legally available. A pattern of title challenge submissions that preceded, rather than followed, the distress sales they were supposedly responding to. In one specific instance, 6 years prior, in a territory 3 counties north, where the same methodology had been used and had gone uninvestigated because the affected families had scattered before they could organize. That last piece was the one that mattered to the board, Webb wrote. Ferris had done this before. He'd refined it. Red Hollow wasn't an experiment. It was a second deployment of a system that had worked once and been improved upon. Cole read that part of the letter at the kitchen table and said nothing for a long moment. "The town to the north," Eliza said. "Yes." He set the letter down. 6 years ago, before I came through." His voice was even. "I wouldn't have known about Ferris at the time, but the methodology, the pattern, it was already running." He looked at the table. "The town didn't scatter because people gave up. They scattered because the legal architecture made resistance look impossible. Without someone who understood what the filings meant." He stopped. She understood what he was carrying. The weight of a connection he hadn't known to make at the time, the retroactive understanding that the thing he'd walked away from had been more deliberate than it appeared. There was nothing useful to say to that. It didn't change what had happened, and it didn't add to what they were doing now. So she just let it sit with him, the way he'd let difficult things sit with her. After a while he said, "Webb says the board is moving toward a finding." I read that part. If the finding includes recommendation for disbarment, Ferris loses his license. He can no longer file anything on Blackthorn's behalf. She looked at the letter. And the challenged claims get reviewed without someone actively managing them. Webb says 3 of the filings are likely to be voided on their merits once they're examined without Ferris running interference. 3 filings voided means 3 properties where the title challenges disappear. Cole looked up. Some of the families who sold, if the challenge that pressured them to sell no longer has legal standing, Webb's looking at that. He says it's complicated. A sale is a sale, and reversing a completed transaction is a different legal matter from voiding a filing. She paused. But he said it's worth pursuing for the families who want to pursue it, that it's possible in some cases, if the sale can be shown to have been made under duress, that was manufactured through fraudulent legal mechanisms. Cole thought about that. Margaret. Margaret's one of the cases he mentioned specifically. Her property was the first one where the challenge was filed after a surveying trespass. The chain is cleanest for her. She looked at the window, at the ranch spread out in the afternoon light. She'd have to want to come back. She'd have to fight for it again. It's not automatic. Have you talked to her? I'm going to. I wanted to wait until there was something real to tell her, not just possibility. She folded the letter. Now there's something real. She went to Margaret Harmon's house on a Thursday, which was when Margaret typically received visitors, and found the woman in her garden doing the kind of work that doesn't need to be done, but provides somewhere to put your hands. Margaret looked up when she heard the horse and waited without coming forward, which was how she'd been since the sale, careful, private, as though she'd drawn a perimeter around herself and was cautious about who crossed it. Eliza dismounted and came to the garden fence and told her what Webb had said. All of it. The investigation, the findings, the voided filings, and the specific possibility that Margaret's situation might be revisable. Margaret listened without interrupting. She had a good quality of attention, this woman. She listened the way she'd handed over the notebook, with a deliberateness that suggested she understood the weight of what was being offered and wasn't going to treat it carelessly. When Eliza finished, Margaret was quiet for a moment. She looked at the garden, then at the access road with its blackthorn stakes. It wouldn't be the same, she said finally. Going back, it wouldn't be the way it was. No, Eliza said, it wouldn't. My husband built that barn. The specific way he built the south wall because he had a theory about wind drainage that nobody else believed in. She looked at her hands. Whatever happens legally with the land, that barn is gone. Those 40 years are gone. Yes. So what would I be going back to? Eliza thought about how to answer honestly. You'd be going back to land that your family worked, that has your name in its history, that you know the way you know your own body, the wet corners, and the dry ridges, and where the first frost comes and where it doesn't. She paused. You'd be going back to something that was taken from you, and taking it back, which is not the same as having it returned. It's an active thing, harder and different. She held the woman's gaze. I'm not telling you you should. I'm telling you it might be possible. What you do with that is yours. Margaret was quiet for a long time. The garden around her was better tended than everything else about her current situation. It was the place, Eliza thought, where she'd been putting her care because it was the one thing she could control. I'll talk to Webb, Margaret said at last. I'm not saying yes. I'm saying I'll talk to him. That's enough, Eliza said. But the bar's formal finding came 7 weeks after the preliminary review. Ferris was found to have engaged in a pattern of conduct constituting professional misconduct, including the submission of land filings based on unlawfully obtained survey data, misrepresentation of credentials to property owners, and coordinated use of legal mechanisms to manufacture distress conditions for financial benefit of a client. His license was suspended pending a full disbarment hearing. 3 of Blackthorn's land claim filings were voided by the Territorial Land Office audit. 2 more were placed under extended review. Sheriff Dolan resigned the same week the findings were published. No announcement, no explanation, just a notice posted on the office door, and the man gone by the following Monday. The deputy who took interim charge was younger and had no visible connection to Blackthorn's operations, and he came to the Voss ranch in his first week and introduced himself and asked if there was anything that needed to be on record. Cole shook his hand and said there were several things. They were there for 2 hours. Victor Blackthorn did not leave Red Hollow territory immediately, which some people found surprising. He remained for another 3 months, operating at reduced capacity. The legal architecture that had supported his expansion dismantled filing by filing, the men he'd employed for enforcement drifting away as it became clear the work had changed in nature. He made one more offer to Eliza, lower than the original, almost perfunctory, delivered through a third party, which she declined without discussion. He sold his Red Hollow operations the following spring to a cattle concern from the south that had no interest in land consolidation schemes and simply wanted grazing territory. What he got for it, Cole estimated from what was publicly known, was considerably less than what the operation had been worth before the investigation began. There is a specific satisfaction in watching a man's own methodology turn against him. The legal architecture meant to create paper trails for his benefit producing. Instead, a paper trail that ended his capacity to operate the way he had. Eliza didn't feel triumphant about it. She felt mostly tired in the way you feel tired when a long, hard thing is finally finished. Depleted but intact, which is its own kind of result. The barn was completed in early winter, before the first real snow. It was smaller than the original. They'd built to what they needed rather than what had been, which was a practical decision, and also, Eliza had come to think, the right one philosophically. You don't rebuild the past, you build what serves the present and leaves room for what might come. Cole had put a weather vane on the roof, not a fancy one, something he'd made himself from materials he had, functional in its form. She'd come out one morning and found it there, already turning in the wind, and had stood looking at it long enough that he'd noticed from inside and come out to stand beside her. It needed something on top, he said. It did, she agreed. They stood there for a moment, the two of them, looking at the structure they'd built from the footprint of the one that had burned. The new wood would weather in time. The weather vane would rust at the joints and someone would eventually have to fix it. The fence lines would need tending every season, and the water system would need watching, and the land itself would ask for more than they expected of it, because land always does. None of that was a problem. It was just the nature of a thing that's real. Margaret Harmon came back to her property in the spring. The legal process had taken longer than hoped and shorter than feared, and what she came back to was not what she'd left. The barn her husband had built was gone, and there were 6 months of neglect on everything else, and the blackthorn stakes along the access road had been removed, but the holes they'd left in the ground were still there, small wounds in the earth that the grass would eventually cover. She came back on a Tuesday morning with a wagon and 2 nephews who'd driven down from the north and didn't ask many questions, which was what she'd needed from them. Eliza and Cole were there when she arrived. So were Briggs and David Solon and Clara Tesh and Garrett, who'd driven 4 hours and hadn't told anyone he was coming, just arrived. They didn't make a ceremony of it. They helped unload the wagon, and they worked through the afternoon on the most urgent repairs. And they ate together in the evening at a table set up outside because the kitchen wasn't ready yet. And the conversation was the ordinary conversation of people who have been through something together and are now on the other side of it, and don't need to keep talking about what it was. At one point, Margaret looked around the table and said, "I didn't expect to be back here." "None of us expected most of this," Clara said. "No." Margaret looked at her land in the evening light. "But here it is anyway." That was, Eliza thought, the most accurate summation of the whole thing she'd heard. There is something worth saying about what this kind of fight costs and what it produces that doesn't fit neatly into the account of events. What it costs is obvious in the ways it's obvious: the barn, the sheep, the lost sleep, the fear that becomes background radiation in your body and takes months to fully dissipate even after the source of it is gone. What it costs in less obvious ways is the version of yourself you had before. The person who believed, on some level, that if you kept your head down and worked hard and didn't bother anyone, the world would return the courtesy. That person doesn't survive an encounter with a man like Victor Blackthorne, not intact. You come out understanding that the world contains people who will take what you have if you let them, and that the only answer to that isn't cynicism, but a clear-eyed decision about what you're willing to do to hold what matters. What it produces is harder to describe, because it's not triumph. It never feels the way you imagine it will from inside the difficulty. What it actually feels like is closer to the specific satisfaction of a thing built solidly enough to stand up to being tested. The fence that holds when the wind comes at it, the water running in its correct channel. The people who said yes in a frightened yard and then kept saying yes through the weeks that followed and came out the other side still standing, still neighbors, still on their land. That's not a small thing. It is, in fact, the whole thing. The land was never only land. It was every morning someone got up and went to work on it, every decision to stay made again in the dark before anyone else was awake to witness it. You can't take that from a person even if you take the acreage. And you can't give it to a person even if you hand them the deed. It's made, day by day, from the particular kind of stubbornness that doesn't know its courage while it's happening. Eliza understood this not as a principle, but as a lived fact. The way you understand the weight of a hammer you've held long enough that your hand knows it before your mind does. The following spring, Eliza and Cole rode the full perimeter of the Voss property together on a morning when the air had the quality it gets after a long winter. Clean, sharp, carrying the smell of things beginning again. The creek was running well. The south fence line was solid. The cattle had wintered better than the year before, and the new calf count was the highest in 3 years. They rode without hurrying, stopping at points Cole had worked on. The berm site where the water had been redirected, now long since restored and unmarked by anything except Eliza's knowledge of what had happened there. The fence section that had been cut so many times that she'd eventually replaced the posts entirely. The east slope where the spring fed down to the main channel, reliable as it had always been under everything else. At the high point of the east slope, where her father had ridden at dawn when he needed to think, they stopped and looked out at the territory. It was a clear morning. You could see a long way. "What do you see?" she asked. Cole looked for a moment. "More than I did when I rode in." She understood what he meant, and it wasn't about the visibility. When he'd ridden in 7 months ago, he'd seen a broken ranch in a bad territory with a woman too stubborn to read the situation clearly. What he saw now was something he'd had a hand in building, which changes what a place looks like in a way that's difficult to articulate and impossible to mistake. "My father loved this view," she said. "He used to say you could see exactly how much work there was left to do." Optimistic interpretation. That was him. She looked at the spread of territory below them, the neighboring properties visible in the distance, the geometry of fence lines and water routes, and the small evidence of human habitation scattered across what was otherwise a landscape indifferent to human plans. "He would have liked you." Cole was quiet for a moment. "I'd like to think so." He valued people who did what they said they'd do, who showed up when it was easier not to. She looked at him. "You showed up." He held her gaze. "So did you." "I didn't have a choice. It was my land." "You had the choice to sell. You had the choice every morning to decide it wasn't worth it anymore." He said it simply, not as flattery, but as the assessment it was. "You didn't take it. That's a choice every time." She looked back at the territory, at the 9 properties spread across it where 9 groups of people were getting up this morning and doing what needed to be done, because they were still there to do it. At the distance where Blackthorn's former operation sat under new and uninterested ownership. At the near distance where the Voss ranch, her ranch, their ranch now, sat with its new barn and its running water and its weather vane turning in the morning wind. She thought about what Ruth Candler had said months ago at the kitchen table. You need a partner, not a hired man, not an arrangement, a partner. Ruth had meant it practically. She'd understood it practically at the time. What she understood now was that Ruth had also been right in the way that cuts deeper than practical. That the thing she'd needed wasn't just someone to split the work with, but someone to stand beside her in the moments when the work was insufficient, and all that remained was the decision about whether to keep going. Someone who made that decision with her, not for her. Someone whose continued presence was an ongoing act of choice rather than obligation. Cole had chosen this, every morning, through the barn fire and the threats, and the 11 days of waiting, and the weeks of documentation and the rides to Crestwood and back. He was choosing it now, sitting his horse on her father's ridge, looking at the land they'd held together. That was worth more than she had words for, and she didn't try to find them. Some things are better honored by being lived than by being said. "We should get back," she said. "David's coming this afternoon to fix the water junction on the north line." "I know. I told him to come after 2. The morning light's better for finding the leak." She looked at him. "When did you tell him that?" "Yesterday, when you were with Margaret." She shook her head slightly. Not in irritation, in something warmer than that, the specific feeling of someone else having thought of the thing you were about to think of, which is its own kind of intimacy. They turned their horses and rode back down the slope, through the morning that was warming now, the light going from sharp to soft, the way mornings do when the season is turning toward what comes next. The ranch came into view as they descended. The new barn, the straight fence lines, the creek catching light where it moved through the lower pasture. Ordinary and imperfect and entirely real. The kind of thing that doesn't look like much to someone passing through, and looks like everything to the people who know what it took to keep it standing. Eliza rode toward it without hurrying. She had work to do and a partner to do it with, and a piece of land that was still hers. That was, in the end, exactly what she'd fought for. And it was enough.